All right, guys. So we're going to do a new little segment. This is what we're going to be doing for several weeks now. We have ranked the top 50 football players at West Virginia of the 21st century because it seems like a lot of people rank the top 50 all-time West Virginia players. So we just thought it would be fun if we just did it, in the past 20 or so years. Who are the top 50 players we've had the pleasure of seeing? And before we get to player number 50, we thought it was only right to have a few honorable mentions. These guys, they were originally on our list, but they got bumped out for other players. But we thought they were worth giving a shout out. First on the honorable mention is Charles Sims, who played just the 2013 year, but he was basically West Virginia's whole offense that year with over 1,000 rushing yards and almost 1,500 total yards. Plus, he had 14 total touchdowns. He was a bright spot on a rough year for the Mountaineers. I believe we only won 4 games that year. And honestly, he probably would have made our list if he would have just played at West Virginia for more than 1 year.
Yeah, he was unreal that year. I mean, just to kind of put it in perspective, he had nearly 900 more yards of total offense than any other offensive skill player on the offense. He only had 100 yards less of total offense than WVU's top passer for the season, which was Clint Trickett, who had 1,600 yards passing that year. And he scored 41% of the team's total touchdowns. Just an unreal season. A real positive on kind of a bad season, like Tyler said. 4 wins, not great. And he went to go on and have a solid NFL career. He got drafted in the 3rd round by Tampa Bay, played for 4 years, and had 958 yards rushing. And this kind of surprised me, 1,190 yards receiving. So more receiving yards than rushing, and 8 total touchdowns. So not only did he have a nice stint here at WVU, where he definitely made a huge impact on offense, but he played in the pros for a little bit, and not an all-time great, not a Pro Bowler or anything, but carved out a nice little niche and hopefully made enough to retire.
Yeah, for sure. And it's always good to see former Mountaineers playing on Sundays. Next on our list was Scooter Berry. He played from 2007 to 2010, and he was just so important on West Virginia's defensive line for those years. He only totaled 7 sacks on his career, but he was an absolute force on that defensive line, and he did a great job of opening up space for other guys.
Yeah. The one thing I always liked about Scooter Berry is, the story behind him. So I believe he came in as a fullback, I want to say. He was friends or like a half brother or something to Jason Gwaltney. So when Gwaltney joined the team and then left because he flunked out or whatever, Scooter Berry stayed, bulked up, ended up playing defensive tackle. So I always thought that was pretty interesting. And he was a guy who was played a lot since his freshman year. He was a really good athlete, just a guy who, liked to eat, liked to lift, get big. And he was a key piece of that defensive line that was so good with Johnny Dingle, who we'll talk about here in a little bit, and Keelan Dykes, who unfortunately didn't make the list, I don't think. Just a really quality guy and a fun story to go with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Keelan did make the list. I think he'll be coming up in a week or so.
That's right. Yeah. We've made so many changes.
I know. We made it took a lot of thought putting this list together. So don't give us too hard of a time if you don't agree with it. But yeah, he just mentioned the next guy. Johnny Dingle was also on our honorable mentions. He played from 2005 to 2007, and he totaled 14 and a half sacks in his career at West Virginia. He played on some of West Virginia's greatest teams while he was here. In his senior year, he racked up 9 sacks and 9 tackles for a loss. So great last year at WVU for Johnny Dingle.
Yeah, he's one guy I would like to see to come back because the previous 2 years before that, you'll kind of notice this is a trend with our honorable mentions. He didn't really do much. He really had that great junior year and then decided to go pro, which didn't really amount to much. Again, if he would have came back for that senior year, who knows what he could have done. He had something really nice to build off of. But that year was really special, especially because he did sack Sam Bradford in the Fiesta Bowl, the game that everyone will remember. for being the game after Rich Rod abandoned WVU and Bill Stewart ended up winning the head coaching job at WVU.
Yeah, for sure. He had a good career. The next guy, this one pained Brandon not to put him on the list, but Will Johnson, who played at West Virginia from 2007 to 2010. He has one of the best underdog stories you'll ever hear. He was a utility player for the Mountaineers who could play fullback, tight end, wherever you needed him. And he also shared time with guys like Tyler Urban. So it wasn't like he was a star or a constant starter. And then he sits out a year after he graduates and then participates in West Virginia's Pro Day in 2012. Ends up getting signed by the Pittsburgh Steelers and has a solid career in the NFL for a few years. And let's not forget about his memorable catch against Marshall in 2010, where he makes a tiptoe catch in the back corner of the end zone with 12 seconds left to help tie the game. Probably the game we were closest to ever losing to Marshall.
Yeah, and I think Will Johnson was just kind of like a late bloomer. I think, I was reading about him where, he was 6'6", 180 pounds coming in. He was a wide receiver. Wasn't really making the depth chart there, so they moved him to tight end, and he was like, I only weigh like 200 pounds now. How am I going to play here? And he ended up continuing to put on weight and getting stronger. He loved being in the weight room and ended up, earning a role for himself as a blocker. And even Tony Gibson said, if you'd have told me Will Johnson be playing in the NFL as a fullback one day, whenever he walked on campus, I would have told you no. But just because of his hard work, his work ethic, his ability to, learn quickly, he had a nice role for the Steelers. I mean, he actually got some catches and carries on that team because he was a very good athlete. I think he ran like a 4.4 or 4.5 for such a big guy. So yeah, I just really like his story. He had a nice niche in the NFL, which I love seeing Mountaineers in the NFL. And, he's someone who, who knows what could have been had he had another year at WVU to kind of develop further and settle into a role. Cause like you said, he did move around a lot.
Yeah, for sure. He just has a great story and was worth giving a shout out. Our last guy before we get into our list is Robert Sands, who was probably closest to making the list. He played at West Virginia from 2008 to 2010, had a monster sophomore season with 5 interceptions. His junior year was okay, and then he went to the NFL to be drafted by the Cincinnati Bengals in the 5th round of the NFL draft. He was a tough one not to put on the list, but he's our last honorable mention.
Yeah, Robert Sands is just kind of, he reminds me of the guy that the NFL always falls in love with, the big, fast, rangy guy who is just oozing potential. And that's kind of what got him drafted in the 3rd round by the Cincinnati Bengals. He didn't end up panning out, but you could see it in that sophomore year where he was doing a little bit of everything. He played primarily that like strong safety / linebacker kind of hybrid role that WVU does. And he was just so disruptive. We mentioned the 5 picks, but 65 tackles as well. That's quite a bit for a safety. And, the following year, his tackles fell, his tackles for loss went up a little bit, but his interceptions went down as well. So, the one thing that he ran into issues with in the NFL was that he wasn't really a safety. He was more of a linebacker. So they moved him to, I believe, outside linebacker, and it just didn't work out there. But, I think another year at WVU, maybe he could have developed his safety skills a little bit more, or maybe he would have transitioned more into a linebacker role and been able to bulk up for the NFL the following year. Just someone who maybe jumped the gun a little bit too much. And we see that every year with guys going into the draft. People fall in love with them. Their agents kind of push them into something that maybe physically or mentally they're not ready for. But that one year at WVU was just so special that we had to include him somewhere, some mention of him on this list because, he's an important piece of West Virginia history.
Yeah, for sure. Just one of the best defensive seasons in recent memory. All right, so let's get into the list here. Coming in at number 50, Chris Neal. Chris played nose tackle at West Virginia from 2007 to 2010. He was a beast on our defensive line, and although he had only 6 sacks in his career, he was so important with clogging up the middle of our defensive line for several years. Nose tackles don't always get a lot of love, but we wanted to acknowledge what a special player he was at WVU.
Oh, yeah. And the one thing about Chris Neal, too, and it's kind of a common trend with Rich Rod recruits, is that they move around a lot. You know, you have Will Johnson moving from wide receiver to tight end / fullback. Chris Neal came in as a tight end and moved to nose tackle and put on a lot of weight to do it. He started 39 games for the Mountaineers, though, from 2008 to 2010. So he's kind of an Iron Man there. That's a lot of games over the course of 3 years when you're the guy who's right in the middle of the defense. He did rack up over 130 tackles for his career, but kind of the crowning achievement for him is that he was that centerpiece that led to some really good rush defenses. So in 2008 and 2009, WVU finished top 40 in rush defense and yards per game, which is solid, nothing exceptional. But in 2010, they had the second best run defense in the country. And Chris Neal was a big part of it. I mean, he was a guy that a lot of people acknowledged as someone who could just eat up 2 or 3 blocks in the middle. Think about how much talk Aaron Donald gets about how much double teams he gets. We had a guy like that who maybe didn't get the penetration that Aaron Donald does, obviously, but someone who was more of a Casey Hampton type for you Steeler fans out there who would just eat up blocks and destroy the inside run game. And it transitioned pretty well for him. He ended up getting drafted in the 7th round by the Washington Redskins, and he did play 4 years serving as a backup nose tackle for them. So, again, a nice little career for him in the NFL.
Yeah, and honestly, he just kept getting injured in the NFL, and if he could have stayed healthy, who knows? I mean, he might have stuck around and had a nice little career, but the injuries just kept piling up for him. But a great Mountaineer nonetheless.
Oh yeah, and I love guys like that who are just like the hard workers, the guys who, it's like having an offensive lineman on the list, which we do have some further up, who are guys who just don't get the mention. Everyone knows their name if you're a Mountaineer fan, but for non-Mountaineer fans, how many people knew of Chris Neal? And he was someone who really allowed our linebackers to do what they did and free up, to eat extra blockers so our defensive ends on those teams could eat as well. And just a really great Mountaineer, never complained. And yeah, he turned himself a nice football career from it.
Yeah, for sure. Coming in at 49 on our list, Jock Sanders. Jock Sanders played at West Virginia from 2007 to 2010. Jock was only listed at 5'6", but he was a special player due to his speed. And WVU tried to use him in, every way that they could. He totaled over 600 rushing yards while he was at West Virginia. But more importantly, he had over 200 catches, nearly 2,000 career receiving yards, and 20 total touchdowns with the rushing and catching. So they used Jock in the slot position, and he was just a really reliable target for, 4 years at West Virginia.
Oh, yeah. And it was interesting, again, another guy who's moving positions. He was recruited, I believe, the same year that Noel Devine was recruited. Mm-hmm. And, those two smaller guys, Jock was actually a running back as well. But then he ended up moving to wide receiver because, Noel's Noel. So it worked out for him tremendously. I mean, not only did he play some running back, not only did he play some wide receiver, but he also served as kick and punt returner. He was kind of our Swiss Army knife. And, that's part of the reason why we included him on here. But he was also the former all-time leader in receptions. He broke David Saunders' record at WVU, which was later broken by Tavon Austin and Stedman Bailey. Which they were extremely special on their own. But, this is kind of my favorite 3-year stretch from him. He had 3 straight years with 50-plus receptions. In 2008, he was first in receptions, second in receiving yards, third in total scrimmage yards for WVU. In 2009, he was first in receptions, first in team receiving yards, second in total scrimmage yards. And in 2010, he was first in receptions, second in team receiving yards behind Tavon Austin, and third in total scrimmage yards. So that 3-year stretch there is just incredible to be that consistent and be that number one guy for such a long time. You don't see that very often. I mean, we're going to talk about a guy here in a couple picks who really only had a 2-year stretch. That was great. Jock did it for 3. And especially in an offense that was run heavy, just exceptional.
Yeah, definitely a solid player at West Virginia. Coming in at 48, Quincy Wilson. Quincy played at West Virginia from 1999 to 2003. He was Avon Coburn's backup at the beginning of his career, and Quincy ran for over 900 yards as a backup his junior year. Then in 2003, he took on the starter's role and did not disappoint, going over 1,400 total yards and scoring 13 touchdowns. His only receiving touchdown of his career was his most famous play, simply known as the run. Quincy juked out several future NFL players, including Vince Wilfork, Sean Taylor, and then he ran over safety Brandon Merriweather, who also had a nice NFL career, launching him off his feet. It's a run West Virginia fans will probably forever see on WVU highlight reels.
Oh, yeah. And it was a clutch one, too. It wasn't just some random play in a blowout. 3rd and 13 with 2 minutes, 13 seconds left in the game against number 2 ranked Miami. WVU was down 13-19 when he made that run. So, that obviously kept him on the list because he was just that play is something that's going to live in WVU lore forever. Even though WVU ended up losing that game, the effort of the single guy to go in there and try to carry his team on the back to the win is just exceptional. He did finish with 2,700 total yards, 21 touchdowns for his career at WVU. And he did have a solid NFL career. He was a 7th round pick by the Bengals. He spent 3 years on the Cincinnati Bengals practice squad. Obviously not where you want to be, but you have the opportunity to get caught up, and he did get caught up a couple times. He actually led the the preseason games a couple years where he led the preseason in rushing, not just for the Bengals, but for the league. So it wasn't for lack of trying that he didn't get NFL looks. But the cool thing is that I believe it was about a week ago, Quincy actually got his first head coaching opportunity. He is now the head coach at the University of Fort Lauderdale after serving as assistant head coach at West Virginia State University for the past several years. So Quincy's still in the game, and let's see how his football journey continues.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know that. And he's also a West Virginia boy. He went to high school not too far from me and Brandon and was just an absolute legend in West Virginia high school as well. When he finished up his career, he was 5th in rushing attempts and 5th in rushing yards all time at WVU. And he's since been passed, but he's still top 10 in rushing yards and attempts. So just a solid career, especially since he was only a starter for 1 year. That's what makes it so impressive that those numbers could be pumped up even more.
Oh, yeah. And in 2003 alone, he had 4 games where he had over 140 yards rushing. He also had a game in 2002 where he had over, I think it was 198 yards rushing. So he was just knew how to power through and get yards. I mean, it kind of reminded me a little bit of KJ Harris, who didn't make the list, except way better durability, way more consistency. I mean, Quincy was special. And, another fun fact is that I think his senior year was the same year that J.R. House was a senior in high school, and they tied for the West Virginia State Player of the Year that year.
Oh, yeah. That's 2 names you hear a lot. That's awesome. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
All right, coming in at 47 is Darryl Worley. Darryl played at West Virginia from 2013 to 2015. He started his junior, sophomore, and even half of his freshman year, and he was a beast, totaling 10 interceptions in his career, and played well enough to forego his senior season and enter the NFL draft. He was a lockdown corner in college, and he's still bouncing around in the NFL. So shout out to number 47 on our list, Darryl Worley.
Oh, yeah. And, his sophomore and junior years were just incredible. 3 interceptions as a sophomore, which led the team, and then another 6 his junior year. But not only did he pick off 6 passes, he finished first in the Big 12 in passes defended with 12. He was first team all Big 12 his junior year. And he was, one of the first cornerbacks that I've seen in a while at WVU that actually I felt like I could rely on. I mean, there were several years where we had guys who were just getting burnt year after year. And, if you weren't running a zone or cover 4 or something, that something bad was going to happen. And when you get Worley in there and he was just locked down, just a really special player. And it led to him being drafted in the 3rd round. I was actually reading today that Worley was actually advised to come back to school. He bet on himself and decided to go pro. And being a 3rd round draft pick isn't bad. He's played in 70 NFL games so far, started in 54. And he's last played for the Baltimore Ravens. He was on their practice squad earlier this year. So he's had a really nice NFL career so far too. So, and he's still young. He's not going away anytime soon. I'm sure we'll see him somewhere else playing on Sundays next year.
Yeah, for sure. It would have been great to have him back one more year, but like you said, I mean, he's still bouncing around. So, maybe he made the right decision by getting out when he did.
Oh yeah.
Number 46 on our list is Gary Jennings. He played at West Virginia from 2015 to 2018. Gary had phenomenal years his junior and senior season, totaling over 2,000 receiving yards on just those 2 seasons alone, and finishing his career with 17 touchdowns. He and David Sills were the two-headed monster that allowed Will Grier to put up huge numbers during his time at WVU. And much like Quincy Wilson and Will Johnson, Gary Jennings had one of the most memorable plays in recent history for West Virginia. With about 20 seconds left on the clock and the clock running, Gary pulled in a 33-yard touchdown in the back of the end zone that allowed Will Grier to run in the 2-point conversion for the walk-off win in Austin, Texas. And then, of course, that was the horns down game that everyone remembers. And just one of the most memorable moments for West Virginia fans in the last decade. So he had to make our list.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that throw and catch was just incredible. I mean, that was a big, big league throw. We'll talk about Will Grier in a future episode a little bit more. But, Gary Jennings was special in his own right. In his junior year, it was kind of strange how his career broke out the last 2 years. He had almost 1,100 yards receiving, but only 1 touchdown. His senior year, he finished with 917 yards receiving and 13 touchdowns, which was good enough to be 6th in the NCAA that year and 2nd in the Big 12. He also served as a kick and punt returner his freshman and sophomore seasons. And he was just exceptional. I mean, talk about someone who, finished his career as number 6th in career receiving yards at WVU, 7th in career receptions, 4th for most touchdowns in a season. 5th in most receptions in school history his junior year. I believe he had 95 that year. 6th in most receiving yards in a season in school history. That was his junior year as well, where he had almost 1,100 yards. So those 2 years were really, really special. And it was crazy too, because, we'll talk about David Sills in a later episode, but, the numbers he put up were pretty insane as well. So the fact that Gary was able to thrive with someone who was just as good, if not better, is just incredible. He was just a really special player and super excited that we got to watch him for a couple years. And Tyler and I were talking the other day, and the one thing that I'll never forget about him is him putting the feather in his helmet. I always thought that was kind of strange, but hey, I knew how to find Gary that way.
Yeah. Like you mentioned, everyone remembers David Sills during that era, but, don't sleep on Gary Jennings. He was a phenomenal player those 2 seasons. And much like Darryl Worley, he's still bouncing around in the NFL. Last I saw, just, I think in early January, he was signed by the Chiefs. I don't know if it was for like their practice squad, but I mean, he's still bouncing around, and who knows, he might catch on with the team and get some playing time. So good for him. And I'm glad he went to West Virginia because he was an awesome player for us.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. He ended up, he was drafted in the 4th round by Seattle, but he's been on the practice squad for 7 different teams so far during his NFL career. So he's bouncing around quite a bit, but teams aren't letting him go. Every time he gets released, someone else tries to grab him up. So they're seeing something. It's just a matter of time, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So that's our list for today, guys. We're only going to do 5 per episode, but let us know if you agree with it, if you thought some of our honorable mentions should have made it. Just find us on social media and let's have a debate about it, because this is fun stuff, and it's always good to give a tip of the cap to some of these great Mountaineers who gave us so many fun years.
Oh yeah, and if you're willing to dedicate the time to it, come up with your own list and compare as we go along and mark the differences, and we can talk about that as we go along.